Hello. My name is Nerma Frieden, and I want to begin by thanking you for this opportunity to share the story about my journey. It is a journey about living through war and genocide and of ultimately coming to terms with my own role in violence, torture, and murder. My journey started more than 26 years ago, on April 6, 1992. This is a picture of me from my student pass at the time. I was a 20-year-old medical school student in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. You know Sarajevo as the host of the 14th Winter Olympic Games in 1984, but I know Sarajevo as the center of a bloody war that had claimed lives of more than 100,000 of innocent people, including my uncle. Before April 6, my life was pretty similar to the life of a student here in the US, studying, going to lectures, hanging out with friends in local cafes, procrastinating. However, on that day, I received an early morning phone call from my aunt. I soon learned that Sarajevo has come to a standstill. There were snipers positioned all around the city, shooting at men, women, and children. Around the city, men wearing black ski masks had erected barricades. I could hear sirens, and I saw ambulances taking injured to a hospital not far from my apartment. I hid in Sarajevo, hoping that the craziness would stop so I could return to my normal life and prepare for exams. But every day I could hear snipers and grenades. One time, I dared to go out and join a peace protest of thousands of unarmed citizens of Sarajevo. When we stopped in front of the parliament building, snipers started shooting at us from the nearby Holiday Inn hotel. I could hear bullets whistling above my head, and a man not far from me fell. Unfortunately, the snipers in Sarajevo were only the beginning. All of the Bosnia was bombed. There was mass rape and genocide had begun. Why was this happening? How could we go from a peaceful country to war overnight? How could human beings do this to each other? It is impossible to describe the history leading up to this conflict in the little time I have with you today. But really, all you need to know is that one more powerful and more armed group of people who happened to be Christians decided that another group of people who happened to be Bosnian Muslims should not be allowed to remain in the land where they have lived for centuries. In 1992, Serbian army and paramilitary forces set out to ethnically cleanse Bosnia of Muslims. As a Bosnian Muslim, I was part of the group that needed to be exterminated. Many Bosnian Muslims were driven into concentration camps where they were tortured, starved, and murdered, and where women and girls were raped. In towns and villages throughout Bosnia, many civilians were killed and families were forced to flee to avoid the same fate. And in just one town, Srebrenica, 8,000 men and boys were rounded and killed over a period of just a few days. The rest of the world knew what was going on, yet they didn't do anything to intervene to stop violence and genocide. They used the word ethnic cleansing to describe what was happening in Bosnia, which was a euphemism for genocide. If they used the word genocide, they would have to do something about it. We had mass graves, rape as a weapon of war, concentration camps, and yet the world powers refused to call it genocide. I was able to leave Sarajevo and go to Zenica, my hometown, just before the city of Sarajevo went into a full siege. At that point, for more than 3 years, nobody could go in or out of Sarajevo except for an occasional plane bringing humanitarian aid. Not long after I was gone, a grenade hit my apartment and destroyed my bedroom. During that time, we had no communication with the family and friends that I left behind in Sarajevo. We had no idea if they were alive or dead. Those who survived suffered extreme conditions without water, food, heat, and power while dodging bullets and grenades on a daily basis. Looking back, it is clear that I made a right decision to leave Sarajevo despite my parents urging me to stay put. They rationalized that I would be safer in Sarajevo because I was in the capital where most of the international attention was focused. How little did we know, how naively we hoped that the world would step in and stop the carnage. I spent 3 years of the war in a small zone no more than 10 miles in diameter that included my hometown Zenica. I volunteered in a local hospital where many wounded were brought in. This is where I experienced some of my most difficult moments during the war. Because the region was under a blockade, the hospital lacked most basic supplies, including anesthetics. The patients screamed as doctors performed minor surgeries, cleaned out shrapnel, and stitched wounds without any pain relief. The hardest work of working there was seeing kids. There is a saying, the more helpless the victim, the more horrific the crime. Oftentimes, these kids were wounded and all alone. We had no idea where the parents were and if they were even alive. I will never forget a boy about 8 years old who was brought in with the bloody bandages covering his eyes. I stood there holding his hand, trying to console him as he cried and called for his parents in his newly darkened world. After he was taken to surgery, I went outside and cried, feeling helplessness and despair. Being there and caring for the youngest victims of the war highlighted the horror and injustice of what was happening around me. Unlike Sarajevo, Zenica did not have constant grenade shelling, but food, water, and energy shortages were serious issues. My family had an apartment in a city and a small house surrounded by fertile land in the village where my father was born. It is that land, along with the wheat flour that my mother stockpiled before the war, that saved us. My mother is a worrywart. Leading up to the war, as the tension in Bosnia grew, she kept buying bags of flour and making a stockpile in her bedroom. At first, we laughed, but then we went under the blockade and the food disappeared from the store shelves overnight. Like everyone else, we were without power for more than 2 years. We also quickly ran out of candles and lamp fuel. Once it would get dark, we couldn't do chores or read or anything really. To pass time in the long winter nights, people would gather together, sit in dark, and talk. We spent a lot of time talking about the foods we used to eat and verbally exchanged recipes for which we had no ingredients. On the few occasions when the power would miraculously appear for a few hours, everyone would get excited and start vacuuming. We had a car, but there was no gas to be found, and so I would often bike between the village and the city on a deserted highway, pulling a makeshift cart behind me filled with the produce from the village. My family was lucky. A lot of people were starving. In the beginning, people were selling their prized possessions on the street. You could buy a gold necklace or a grandfather clock for a couple pounds of flour. It is amazing how all of the material things that we had desired became worthless overnight. Many elderly people were found dead in their apartments with nothing but salt in their cupboards. Others took their own lives to avoid a slow death. And of course, there was always the fear that we would actually be killed. I personally was not afraid of being shot, but what I feared most was the possibility of having my throat slit. I learned that the enemy forces practiced slaughter techniques on live pigs before they invaded towns and villages, and used these skills on men, women, and children. I also feared being captured alive, being tortured and raped. I was afraid that I would find myself at the mercy of someone who had no mercy for me, someone who didn't see me as a human being. My family had a couple grenades and a handgun, and I was determined to fight the enemy if attacked. And I also found peace knowing that if I were overtaken, the gun would spare me from being captured. My fears were not unfounded. In 1993, just 3 miles from our village house, another village, Ahmići, was burned to the ground by Croatian forces. 120 people, including young kids and babies, were murdered. Some men had been rounded up and were killed in front of their families. Others, including women and children, were burned alive inside their homes. Toward the end of the war, I was smuggled out of the country disguised as a Red Cross worker. I was able to come to the US as a refugee and make life for myself here. Now let's fast forward by 10 years. I was married and the mother of 2 young daughters, and we had just moved to Peoria, Illinois. Despite being Bosnian Muslim, I'm not religious, and I'm quite liberal. As a result, when I moved to the Peoria area, I found myself not quite fitting in. I ended up finding the UU Church there, where I felt welcomed and at home. I had found my community. After a few years of being a member, I attended a summer sermon that would change my life. The sermon was called Ethical Eating. It was presented by the members of church, Chris and Danielle Moberg. I had an idea of what this sermon would be about, but I had not anticipated the effect that it would have on me. Their presentation was about the impact that our food choices have on our health, animals, and the environment. The presentation was not graphic. There was no gruesome pictures. Chris and Danielle merely described the realities of animal agriculture as they shared the facts about the treatment of the animals that we consume. From that sermon, I was shocked to learn that there is no laws to protect farm birds as chickens or turkeys, and that it is perfectly legal to burn, bury, or chop them up alive. I listened in disbelief about the intensive confinement of pregnant female pigs. These intelligent animals spend most of their life in spaces so small that they cannot even turn around. Many of them go crazy and mutilate themselves on the bars that surround them. I learned about the painful and routine mutilations of beaks, horns, tails, teeth, and testicles that farm animals are forced to endure with no pain relief. As I listened to Chris and Danielle's sermon, an immense distress, sadness, and horror came over me. I listened to what was happening to these animals, the atrocities, the suffering, and the injustice of it all. What was being done to these innocent animals and their babies would not be done to the worst members of our society, not to our rapists, pedophiles, or murderers. I sat in a pew, tears running down my face, feeling a tightness in my chest, a knot in my throat, and I was surprised at the intensity of my emotions. After the sermon ended, I wanted to meet and talk to Chris and Danielle, but I could not stop crying. My eyes and my heart had been opened, and so many emotions came flooding in. I went to the bathroom to collect myself, and after that didn't work, I snuck out of side door. As I drove back home, it became clear to me that by purchasing and consuming the flesh, the eggs, the milk of animals, I personally shared the responsibility for the violence committed against farmed animals. Of course, I would never dream of hurting an animal personally. I would never draw a knife across her throat and watch her fight to live. Yet I paid for this to happen every day for most of my life. I realized then that my actions made me just as guilty as the people who did these deeds and profited from their pain. My actions were not aligned with my values of compassion and justice. And this is true even on most so-called humane or free-range farms, despite what we would like to believe. For the second parallel, when I think back about my experience of living through a war and genocide, I realize today that I was lucky that I was only 20 years old and I didn't have kids of my own. All I had to worry about was myself. I have 3 young girls now, and the idea of living through a war with kids sends shivers down my spine. How do you protect your kids when an enemy intent on killing you is closing in? Indeed, during the Bosnian War, some of the most tragic accounts were those of mothers who have witnessed their kids being taken away and killed. You don't have to be a mother to have some idea what unimaginable pain and grief these mothers go through. Sadly, something similar happens every single day on dairy farms across the US. Cows are mammals, just like we are. And just like us, cows don't produce milk unless they have had a baby. Just like human mothers, a mother cow carries her baby for 9 months. And just like for us, protecting and caring for that baby comes naturally to her. On dairy farms, we take the babies away from their mothers within hours of birth so that we humans can steal and consume milk. Mother cows will cry out for days for their babies. They will break down fences and walk miles searching for their babies. Ultimately, their babies are killed within days or weeks of birth, or they eventually end up replacing their mothers. In order to keep the milk flowing, cows are forcibly impregnated and have baby once a year. So they are therefore subjected to this painful grieving process multiple times during their life. At a fraction of their natural lifespan, when they no longer produce enough milk to be profitable, the mother cows are retired to a slaughterhouse. The thought of someone taking my babies from me and hurting and killing them is horrific. And it was unbelievably disturbing for me to realize that this is exactly what I was paying for whenever I bought dairy products. And now to parallel number 3. According to Amnesty International, the use of rape in Bosnia was not simply a byproduct of conflict, but it was a pre-planned and deliberate military strategy. The Serb forces set up rape camps where women were repeatedly raped until pregnant and only released once it was too late to stop the pregnancy. In addition to having the goals of demoralizing and terrorizing these Muslim communities, the mass rape program aimed to further populate the nation with the children having the same ethnicity as the assailants. In other words, it was a program of forcible impregnation. On farms across the US, females are forcibly impregnated under the euphemism of artificial insemination. The goal here is to give birth to the obscenely inordinate number of animals needed to satisfy our desire for flesh, milk, and eggs. And by obscenely inordinate, I mean roughly 9 billion land animals, or in other words, about 28 animals per year for each of us. As a woman, And as a mother of 3 soon-to-be women, I can no longer hear this 28 animals per year statistic thinking about the way the females of those species are violated. And finally, parallel number 4. I mentioned earlier that there was a reluctance in the international community to describe the war in Bosnia as a genocide. Now, 26 years later, it is widely recognized that it was a genocide. Now, it is estimated that between 25 and 30,000 innocent Bosnian Muslim civilians were killed during the war. The only thing those men, women, and children were guilty of was being born into a wrong ethnicity. Every year in the United States, roughly 9 billion innocent animals are killed because they were simply born into a wrong species. Regardless of society's efforts to disconnect us from the truth, we all know that animal lives are lost when we consume their flesh. But many would be surprised to learn that the killing does not end there. For instance, male chicks born in egg industry are useless to that industry because they don't lay eggs. Those same male chicks are useless to meat industry because they don't grow rapidly enough. So what does the egg industry do with 250 million unwanted male chicks that are born in the US every year? The newborns are ground up alive or thrown into trash cans where they slowly suffocate on top of one another. Even cage-free, free-range, and backyard farmers get their female chicks from operations that discard the males. I had always considered myself to be an animal lover, but like all of us, I grew up in a world that is constantly and repeatedly telling us lies, that is conditioning us from the day one to believe lies such as we need calcium from milk to get strong bones, or we are repeatedly told the lie that we need animal flesh for protein, when in fact there is protein in plant foods, more than enough. It turns out we are much healthier when we eat only plant-based foods. I was so horrified by what I had learned about our treatment of animals, and I thought everyone would want to know this truth. And more importantly, to know that they didn't have to be part of that violence. But most people I shared this information with had different reactions. Instead of wanting to be aware, many preferred not to know what was happening to farmed animals, or they wanted to deny that things were really that bad. Just as the world leaders denied that there was a genocide happening in Bosnia, it was easier to people to deny that we are waging a massive, endless war against our fellow animals. In both instances, denial shields people from having to do something about the problem, and shields them from having to change their own behavior. The other common reaction that I've gotten when I shared my story with others is anger and outrage that I would dare to compare animals with humans. After all, they are just animals, and they are not like us. My question is, why should I not compare humans and other animals? James Aspey, an animal rights activist, says, "We are all socialized to believe the lie that animals are inferior to humans, when in fact, humans are animals. In ways that matter, we are the same. We have brain, we have a heart, we have friends, we have families. We care for our young, we have feelings and emotions. We desire pleasure, and we don't want pain." I have learned that the reaction of they are just animals or they are not like us is a reaction mired in speciesism. Speciesism is a false belief that one species is superior to another and is in the same category as racism, sexism, heterosexism, and all the other violent belief systems. So when I hear the argument they are not like us, I cannot help but think of all the racists, sexists, and homophobes who have used that exact argument to oppress and brutalize our fellow humans. Paul Watson, the founder of Sea Shepherd, once said, "If you want to know where you would have stood on slavery before the Civil War, don't look at where you stand on slavery today. Look at where you stand on animal rights." I have come to the realization that all forms of oppressions are interconnected. Sexism, racism, heterosexism, speciesism. But speciesism plays a special role in that interconnectedness. In fact, it is a prerequisite. Because in order to treat our fellow humans as subhuman, we first need the concept of human supremacy. Alex Hershoft, a Holocaust survivor, explained how speciesism lays the foundation for all other types of oppression. The oppression of animals is the gateway drug to oppressing humans. When a child is first told that the dog on his sofa is to be loved and cherished, whereas the pig on his plate is to be abused, killed, dismembered, and eaten for food, that is the first time we instill the notion in the child's mind that it is okay to discriminate between two living beings that basically look and seem alike, which is the basis of all forms of oppression. You are basically telling one living being that he can live and another that he must die. Throughout history, the most horrific crimes against humanity were committed in situations where we find dehumanization of victims. Enslaved black people were called monkeys. Jews were pictured as rats in Nazi Germany. In Rwanda's conflict, Tutsi were called cockroaches. And just last year, I heard a white supremacist from Charlotte refer to non-whites as vermin. Famous philosopher Adorno says, Auschwitz begins whenever someone looks at the slaughterhouse and thinks they are only animals. It is no coincidence that my identification with our fellow animals is so strong. I believe that my own experience of living through genocide has made me more empathetic to the immense suffering they are subjected to. And sadly, this world is filled with suffering, oppression, violence, and injustice. At times, it can be overwhelming. Indeed, I often feel powerless in this world, powerless to stop the oppression and the violence and the suffering, and most of it is beyond my control. But I do hold a great power in my hands, which is voting with my wallet every single day. Where and how I spend my money is a political statement. By buying only animal-free products, I refuse to fund violence and cruelty. There are certainly times when it would be easier and more convenient for me to eat animal products. But the truth is that what is convenient is not always best and not the right thing to do. I have had to face my role in hurting and killing others. And although I can't make up for the violence I caused, I know that in order to live my values, I must be willing to stand up for what I know is right, even when it's not easy or convenient. A lot of us are familiar with the story of Wade Still and Martha Sharp. This daring couple, a Unitarian minister and his wife from Massachusetts, left their children behind in the care of their parish and boldly committed to multiple life-threatening missions in Europe to save Jews from Nazi regime. This couple learned of grave injustice and refused to look away. They chose to live their values by putting their own lives at risk. We don't have to engage in dangerous missions or risk our lives in order to align our values and our actions. All we have to do is put select what we put in our shopping carts and what we order in restaurants, change what we do. It is that easy. Thank you.